Hello, and thank you for joining our live Q&A webinar presented by Hanna Instruments and Heliospectra. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your part of the world. Just a short introduction about the two companies that have sponsored this webinar today. Heliospectra was founded in 2006 in Sweden by plant scientists and biologists with one vision: to make crop production more intelligent and resource efficient. Today, with customers across 6 continents, Heliospectra is the global leader in innovative horticulture lighting technology, custom light control systems, and specialized services for greenhouse and controlled plant growth environments. Hanna Instruments has been developing innovative products that make analytical measurements easier to perform at an affordable price for 44 years. And Hanna Instruments is actually doing a giveaway today for this webinar. So everyone who attends will automatically be entered for a chance to win a free Hanna Halo 2 Grow Line Wireless Soil pH Tester. These are $149 pH testers, and we will announce 2 lucky winners at the end of the webinar today. So you only have to wait an hour. I would like to hand over to Mike from Hanna Instruments and Ryan from Heliospectra just to give us a short bio before we start going through the questions.
Okay, I guess I'll start. Hello, I'm Mike from Hanna Instruments, Mike Wogolowski. I've been with Hanna for a very long time, several years, and I developed the fertigation system. And I head up the agriculture division. And basically, I've done almost everything imaginable when it comes to irrigation and nutrient injection, when it comes to introducing and controlling nutrients that alter or modify pH values, and test all types of water parameters in greenhouses and grow facilities. So we bring a lot of expertise to bear, and we hopefully can answer all of your questions today. And I want to thank Heliospectra's team today. Ryan and I have done this a few times in the past, and it's always been a lot of fun. Looking forward to it.
Right on. Thanks, Mike. And I definitely echo the partnership that we've been able to work together has been very effective, and I think very useful for growers out there. So I definitely would like to thank Hanna, and thanks to Marie, although she is a host here on the webinar. I would say you do have 3 experts, and she's been a very valuable resource for the cannabis community. So I will hopefully that she can get involved and share some of her knowledge that she brings to the table as well. A little bit about myself. My name is Ryan Walkel. I work as the plant and light expert in Heliospectra in our HelioCare services team. I am a 2nd generation cannabis grower. I ran multiple cannabis facilities from 2009 to 2015 in the Denver and Boulder area, a 2-time High Times Cannabis Cup winner. A little bit that people don't also realize, I do have field crop production experience in greenhouse as well. So I definitely encourage to ask us anything today, whether it's non-cannabis, food related, branding. I know Marie brings a lot to the table when we talk about that. So I definitely encourage having a open conversation today, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. So thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, guys. Okay, here we go. On to question number. Okay, the first question is like a quadruple barreled question. So let's get into it because we've got a long list here. So this is a good one though. Okay, this is probably more for Mike. Does the H191030 pH probe have a temperature sensor?
Yes.
Okay. How does the soil moisture affect that probe's conductivity for the pH probe and the direct stick conductivity meter? And is the function affected by environmental relative humidity?
Okay, so yes, the tester, we'll start in the beginning. Yes, the tester has a temperature sensor. Now, it's very important that it does because it measures pH, and also EC parameters are affected by temperature, right? And also the electrode itself, the performance of the electrode is affected by temperature. So I'm going to take a minute to make that, to distinguish between the two, because it's an important comparison, right? There is the pH of your soil, this pH of your irrigation water, right? There is the pH sensor itself, right? So you use the pH sensor to measure the pH level of your water, of your soil, obviously. Well, both are affected by temperature. One is important and one is directly related. That's the temperature of the soil, of your water, what have you, because that directly affects the pH of the water. Okay, and there are other factors involved too. But it also affects the performance of the electrode. So it's important that you have a temperature sensor on board your pH meter to compensate for the effect temperature has on the electrode itself. That's where temperature compensation comes into play. So it's a very important factor. And most pH testers and most pH devices will incorporate some way to measure temperature in order to compensate for that error. Now, if you're testing around 7 pH all the time and you're in neutral conditions and your temperature is always at ambient, there's not as much a need for that sensor. So you may find very inexpensive testers that don't have a pH, that don't have a temperature sensor on board, but this particular tester does. EC is also temperature dependent. As the EC changes, molecular activity increases, right? So your EC value goes up, okay? But the concentration of the stuff in the water and in your soil, that doesn't change. So if you heat up water and you have salt, well, the molecular activity increases, the EC goes up, but you still have the same amount of salt in there. So you want to compensate, you want to use your temperature sensor on your testers, and you want to compensate back to what it is at ambient, or at 20 degrees or 25 degrees C, okay? So you know that even though my activity is greater, the molecular activity is greater, and I'm getting a higher value, that's not representative of the stuff that's in there, the concentration of the stuff that's in there. So you want to compensate that back and get that number back down. So yeah, so that's why we have a temperature sensor. And if you're going to buy a tester and you're going to buy some sort of meter to measure pH and EC, get one with a temperature sensor on board. Absolutely. Now, yeah, what were the you had two other questions as well, just in case I didn't cover those.
So how is probe function affected by environmental relative humidity? And then the last part of that, they were curious about the direct stick conductivity meter being calibrated in liquid, but not intended to be used in a pure liquid solution. So just some questions around how that.
Great questions. Okay, so RH typically, okay, a pH sensor, EC sensors, they're made to test liquid and soil that's highly saturated. So the RH of the air is really not playing much of a factor in what's happening inside that solution, because that water, you're already 100%, right? So that's really kind of not really an issue. As far as that's concerned, yeah. Now, as far as that direct stick conductivity sensor, it will work in solution. You just have to be careful on how you use it. Not to get too technical, but with a conductivity sensor, you typically have probes and you have some sort of cylinder that establishes what's called a cell count. Now, with the direct stick conductivity sensor, you don't have this kind of cylinder over the sensor that establishes this constant, this factor that keeps things at a fixed value all the time. So when you use it in soil, it works in such a way where that really isn't relevant per se. But when you're in a container containing solution, if you get too close to the edge of that container, you kind of could mess with that that cell constant a little bit, or you get too close to the bottom of the container, you mess with it again. So you got to kind of be more careful with a direct stick when you're testing it or calibrating directly in solution, to kind of hold it in the center of the solution itself, so it's not near the walls of the container, to kind of fudge that cell constant and create error. So that's the difference. The direct stick, it doesn't have that kind of self-established shield, if you will, that will establish that cell constant. So you got to be careful of how you use it when you're testing the solution.
Okay.
Yeah, I think all real helpful advice for sure. I think people always have a full challenge of actually understanding that, and the amount of variances. Your sensor is really going to be only as good as how you're using it, essentially.
Exactly.
And a touch on, I like to, and just a real quick touch, when we're talking about temperature and what that actually does to your EC and salt content, it's kind of similar in the sense of relative humidity. That relative humidity is a relative to what temperature is going on into your room, and thus why growers heavily rely on vapor pressure deficit and VPD, because just because you warm that room temperature up, it holds more water. The amount of water or moisture in that air doesn't change. It's just that warmer air holds more moisture. So always keeping that in mind.
Exactly.
So now that you've brought up vapor pressure deficit, I'm going to jump to that question actually, because we do have a question asking the best way to measure VPD.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead.
The most cheap, inexpensive way is essentially an infrared temperature gun. You really want to measure your surface temperature of your leaf. That is going to kind of work in conjunction to your relative humidity again. There's a lot of good VPD charts out there that you can follow. There are some differences between the VPD from an HPS to an LED room, just because you're not you're not providing the infrared and all of the reflective heat down onto the crop. For me, I find the most ineffective way of at least getting it's not so much of your ambient room temperature, but what temperature your plant is. That is going to give you the best guideline to then tell you what relative humidity that you need to fall in order for your stomata to open. So when I go on site, I always bring a toolkit, and part of that toolkit is an infrared temperature sensor that I can measure that leaf surface temperature. Mike, do you have some ads?
Oh yeah, sure. I would say obviously, you got two factors. You got VP sat and I believe VP air, if I'm not mistaken. So you have, Ryan's absolutely 1000% correct. You got to have red on that leaf. You got to know your temperature there, and then the RH of the room, right? I believe it's VP sat minus VP air is how you calculate it. So you could get something very expensive, inexpensive RH transmitter that you can put in the room. You could have a handheld RH meter that could give you that value, and you throw it into this formula you can find online anywhere. And if you really want to calculate it out and go to that length, you can. As far as values, it's measured in, Ryan, if I'm not mistaken, it can be measured in PSI, but it can also be measured in kilopascals, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the range is somewhere, and again, this is probably more Ryan's ballpark, but you want to be somewhere in the ballpark of 0.8 to 1.1, 1.3, somewhere for veg, and it's a little higher for flower, like 1 to 1.5, somewhere around there. So there's some technical information for you, but those are the components. You have your temperature, your leaf, and then you have the RH of the room, and then you can go online and find the math anywhere to figure it out.
And it's one of the things when we're talking about raising that warm temperature, and I think it's one of the most common problems that I see growers and facilities struggle with when switching from traditional HPS lighting or legacy lighting and going to LED, that Of course, they have to run that hotter room. There's no infrared to heat up the surface temperature of the leaf. So you have to do that with ambient room temperature. And the first thing that people do, they just assume, okay, I want to raise it to, 27 Celsius, or I'll raise it to 81 to 83 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they don't supplement any moisture back into the room. So when they might have 50% relative humidity at 78 degrees and they bump up that temperature to 82, their relative humidity instantly starts to drop. That tells the plant to close the stomata, protect itself, hold moisture in. You're going to reduce your photosynthetic rate quite significant. So understanding that balance between the two is super important, especially when you're switching from, legacy technology to LED lighting. Always keeping that in mind.
Absolutely. And another point too, from a nutrient perspective, when you stress the plant like that, it's going to try to draw in tremendous amounts of nutrient, which could cause. So that's
Yep.
All right. I've picked out this next question just because it's something I'm actually super curious about as well. So lighting recommendations for vegetative stages of cannabis tissue culture. It seems like tissue culture is really taking off, and yeah, quite curious your thoughts on that, especially Ryan. If you want to start on this one, that would be perfect.
Yep, no problem. I will start by also saying I am not a tissue culturing expert. With that being said, of course, being a lighting company, we do deal with all sorts of commercial cannabis operations that are dealing with tissue culture. I would say for the most part, you're looking at really, really low levels of light, particularly at that beginning stages. There's not much growth that's actually happening during those times. Typically, I find anywhere between 25 micromoles up to 50. And just to give you an idea, if we're talking about the cloning process, we're going to run anywhere from 75 micromoles to 150. So you're almost looking at essentially almost twice as much light that's being provided to a cutting. Now, granted, when that plant does start to grow, and I think what a lot of tissue culture operations struggle is to start to get some of that lateral growth instead of the plant kind of just kind of looking really viney and not growing up tall. And I would say that is when you can start to increase some of your light. What I find interesting, and it's still very early on phases, is how light spectrum is going to influence tissue culture. For instance, that far red could potentially have a large significance on root production with the tissue culture. I think that there's obviously some academics that are going to start to look at it. I wouldn't have the specifics on telling you what I typically see. For the most part, I see a pretty general, pretty white heavy, broad spectrum lamp at really, really low levels of light. So lighting requirements are not that great for tissue culture. So I hope that helps, but I am not the expert. I'll see more and more facilities that will start to implement tissue culture for just genetic storage, for cleaning the genetic to make sure they can protect its genetic integrity. You are starting to see operations that strictly focus solely on tissue culture. And for a lot of the, I've seen a lot. I am in Canada currently, and I've worked with a couple LPs that are working only from tissue culture, and they believe like having that clean slate is worth the maybe little more investment from handling all of the processes themselves.
Yeah, I would only add that I concur with Ryan. That's I am also not a tissue culture expert, but that was very informative, Ryan. Excellent.
I try.
So we have another question that sort of leads into what you were touching on with the stretch. So we have a question here. What environmental measures can you recommend to help control the stretch mid/end of the stretch period? So I know the lighting is going to come into that a bit as well.
There's a lot that I would say comes into play and how of controlling that the stretch, especially towards the end to late part of that stretch can be pretty tricky. Light is a big influencing factor. The particular spectrum, your micromole level definitely plays a large part. So essentially your intensity, or we always say light quantity, how much quantity of light. You can combat some stretching if you are if you are running at lower levels of light. I would increasing to higher levels of light. If you don't have access to a spectrum control sort of light, because there are spectral shifts that you can do. Blue light does promote a plant to keep short and squatty. So if you do have access to a spectrum controlled light like the Elixia, what we offer, you can start to essentially change those ratios of blue to red. There's a lot that can introduce stretching, even an excessive amount of green or white light, depending on those specific proportions of light, can induce a stretching effect. So being able to provide the light right at the right sort of times is key. The environmental, I would say one of my favorite uses to control the stretch is actually running a neutral diff, or actually running a positive dip of nighttime temperatures. So if you were to be running your room at 80 degrees when the lights are on, if you run a warmer room at the nighttime, you can control a lot of internodal stretching. Typically what I find is people in the summer, I had the same thing in my facility in the summer. The HVAC was becoming too fatigued. It was old. It couldn't keep up. So a lot of the times you have this theory to pre-cool your rooms before the lights go off. So when the lights are off, you pre-cool your room before the lights go on. Excuse me. So you try to get the walls, the floor, kind of everything as cold as you can, just because you know your HVAC can't keep up. Now the problem is that you're now running, essentially you're running a negative diff, and that is going to give you your colder night temperatures are going to influence that stretch factor quite significantly. So I typically always see excess stretching in the summer, just because of usually, and it's a clear sign for me as a grower that they probably have undersized HVAC, or they're having an HVAC issue or problem. Would I recommend environment wise, keep that at the very beginning, keep the same daytime temperature as nighttime. That's, for me, it's so key to keeping to try to combat that morphology of the plant wanting to stretch. There's a few things of why you're telling the plant to flower. You're doing a spectral shift. So typically you're moving from a heavy blue light to a red light, and red light promotes stem elongation. And that triggering to 12-12 and is also triggering that plant to go through the motions of essentially surviving. So keep that temperature neutral for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, temperature is everything. So obviously that cycle of night to day, inverse that process, and you will slow stretching down. Also, the rate how you feed, increasing the feeding, increasing or decreasing EC will either slow down or speed up the growth process. Lower substrate temperatures, when we want to increase slow down vegetative growth and increase flowering or generative growth. We want to increase EC and lower the substrate temperature, for example. So these things are strategies you can definitely employ. The frequency of feedings. So maybe increasing the frequency, the lower the pulse of feedings, but the feeding times, you lower you actually so the amount of time that you feed. Okay, that will influence your growth state or in the flowering state. So there's a variety of different combinations of approaches you can take to either increase growth, stretch, or decrease that stretching effect. Temperature is key. I mean, for external environmental effects, like Ryan was saying, you're absolutely, if you increase that night temperature versus that day temperature, there's something called cool morning pulse, was an old greenhouse term, where you could do a degree of an inverse in the morning by 5 or 10 degrees, a shift to slow down that stretching process for like 3 hours in the morning or so. That's an old greenhouse practice, cool morning pulse it was called. So there's again, a variety of things that you can do with feedings and with temperature, but temperature is key.
Yeah, good point on the feeding schedule, what you're feeding. I typically do a nice phosphorus boost, either that last week of veg or that first week of flowering, and you'll start to see that you'll get tighter internodes. Your spacing becomes a lot more decreased, with that fertigation technique, for sure. And then I definitely encourage, for me, I'm really big into canopy manipulation. So any sort of super cropping, scrogging, if you're using some screening, those methods to keep those plants kind of even. An even canopy is quite key to a proper yield, essentially.
Right. And you could incorporate moisture sensors, because by increasing the moisture or decreasing the moisture of the substrate, right? Increasing growth by increasing moisture of the substrate, decreasing the moisture of the substrate to affect flowering, right? To slow down. So a moisture sensor is another environmental type of sensor, if you will, that will communicate hopefully back to a centralized system that will also govern the amount of irrigation, amount of water you apply to your facility or to your.
Okay, speaking of substrates, we actually have a living soil question here. Does living soil require being pH'd, or do the microbes and biology level themselves out? Do we know what it corrects to? And do you only interfere with the pH in living soil when issues arise?
I hate living soil. We don't have to do anything. No, living soil is fantastic. Obviously, the whole point of it, right, is to create a buffered environment using organics, using living things, right, to kind of create that natural buffered pH, that optimum environment to grow, right? So hopefully you don't have to do anything, right? But you got to be careful about the water you use too, right? You don't want to, if you're going to use, here's a couple of things you got to realize. Living things in there, right? So we don't want to kill them, okay? And we want to make sure that the water we're using doesn't extract nutrients and doesn't take away the properties that are important to that environment. So if you're using a municipal supply, right, we're not going to use RO, okay? You want to stay away from RO when we're talking about living soils. But what we do want to consider using is a carbon filter, some type of carbon filtration system. And the reason being is, there's nothing that kills better than chlorine and chloramines. And there's a whole bunch of that in your municipal water supply. Chloramines are very bad. They're a form of chlorine, but they're very stable and very hard to get rid of. And you got to kind of remove them when you get them out of your water. Chlorine kind of dissipates, but it still goes into what's called a combined chlorine phase and mixes with the ammonia radicals in the water and all the junk, and that's can be hard to get rid of. So you want some type of carbon filtration system in place to make sure your water is clean before it gets that media. It's very important. And sometimes depending on what you're feeding the soil with, you want to go organic, Roundup heads or whatever organic material you're going to use to feed those, to feed that environment, to feed that soil. Sometimes, the pH can get out of whack, and you want to use you can use something as primitive as lime juice or citric acid. And these things can really kind of bring that pH back to where you need it to be. That's where, your direct soil analyzer comes into play. You're not working on pour through per se. I would go with a direct stick because you don't want to oversaturate the soil. You want to keep things as balanced as possible. So that direct stick is the least intrusive way to really get an idea of what's going on in that soil. The whole point, again, back to your question, the whole purpose of it is to create a natural environment that really doesn't need us getting involved in adding stuff to it. That's the whole thing. So, okay.
Yeah, I see growers go both ways. I do know growers that tend to pH essentially their carbon filtered water. Most growers do stay away from RO, and if they do use RO, they'll figure out some way of essentially back mixing some of that dirty water or kind of water that still has some residual nutrients essentially to your plant, because you don't want to just start out with a complete blank slate. That is also, though, you typically don't see as high as a pH as what you do in, say, a hydroponic solution, where you're going to pH down to, say, a 5.8. Typically, we find that a 6.5, between 6.2 to 6.5 can work really well with living soil. You don't want to dump acid onto all of your microbial activity. You will kill them. If you're doing the same thing with the chlorine or essentially bleach, you will damage your delicate ecosystem within that soil. It does depend sometimes, as what you meant, some of the dry amendments that can help with pH buffering. And Mike said it's essentially this buffer safe zone where you're trying to create this symbiotic balance between the roots, the microorganisms, the plant itself. So you do need to provide a pretty ideal environment with not essentially a lot of effort going into it. So if you're using something like dolomite lime or I would say oyster shells or things that are ground, some of those take a little bit longer it's not an instant fix. If you're starting to see that pH off, but for the most time you'll see and test your runoff, and it's pretty steady for the most part. But just monitor that runoff. If you start to see it going down the wrong way, it starts to be a challenge. I'm not a living soil. I do believe that there is a place and that it makes high quality product, but I would go to my living soil mentors like Av Singh. I would ask Av what's going on and be very clear of what's going on in some of the other growers that we work with. So I would say yes, I would pH my soil, but not too heavy.
Yeah. And I think this is a good opportunity to kind of segue into, you're talk a little bit about water quality too. I think that, that's vital, right? That's going to really affect things a lot. And we said stay away from RO. And I think it's a good time to touch on that, and because there's a lot of misconceptions about reverse osmosis, right? So I see growers all the time trying to pH RO water. And I'm saying, why are you doing that? Why? And well, the pH is 6.5. I need to get it to 5.8. I said, well, do you know why it's 6.5? Because the actual reaction within the RO system, the RO membranes generate carbonic acid, and basically that does lower the pH. But essentially, there's nothing there, right? There's no buffering capacity, and we'll talk a little bit about alkalinity in a bit, I'm sure. But there's nothing in there. So whatever you add to it, that RO water becomes it immediately. So there's really no way to control that. When you add an acid to it, you're going to drop that RO water down to 3 pH in a heartbeat because there's no buffering capacity to the water. Another thing too is pure water is corrosive. When you really think about it. If you look at what municipalities do, right? They add bicarbonates to the water. Why do they do that? Because the pipe in your house is copper. So if you add pure water is like this massive sponge, right? It's this corrosive material. So if it sees copper with these loose valence electrons floating around and on the atomic level, it draws all this out of the copper, and what happens to your copper? Corrodes, right? corrodes, it breaks down. So when you add that water to a living soil in that type of environment, that type of going to draw everything out of that soil in essence to keep it simple and into that water. So kind of really, it's really detrimental to not only the organics that are present, but any type of nutrients that may be there as well.
Yeah, we used to always get false. You gotta be careful with organics because, as Mike points, you can get false readings from organics as well. That can give you essentially a false pH reading.
Great point. Great point. And when you're trying to use Ryan, that is an excellent point. When you're trying to use technology with organics too, especially when you're trying to use EC, sometimes you won't be able to get an EC reading that really correlates the amount of organic matter that you're dealing with. So there's really no correlation. So you kind of, it's great. And I'm in no way throwing the organic world under the bus here, but there's really no way to use a lot of technology with organics in certain ways that we take for granted with inorganic materials that we use and we can manipulate very easily. So yes, Ryan's point is a tremendous one, that technology doesn't always figure out what's going on the organic level. So.
Awesome. And we do have a question here about measuring runoff as well. So can you provide the reasons behind a stationary pH meter and a pen meter for checking runoff / pour through of nutrients, etc.?
Stationary versus, well, a pH meter is a pH meter is a pH meter, right? There's different components to a pH tester, a pH meter, a pH electrode. Some are quicker, some are more robust, like a process electrode, because the bulb is larger versus a smaller bulb on a tester. But essentially, you're going to get the same result in the end, right? As long as it's good quality Hanna Instruments pH meter, you're going to get excellent and reliable results. Really, where you draw the line is between, let's say, a handheld instrument, a tester, and let's say a process inline sensor and controller. So you can measure something in line continuously versus just spot checking. You can do a direct analysis in the soil or pour through. Runoff and pour throughs are good techniques. You're going to have the water is going to kind of influence things a little bit more because you're kind of dissolving stuff, which is good and bad. So, you know, it depends on, you know, what types of results you're looking for. The runoff basically is important to measure. I would measure that in a continuous process. And that way, are you treating that runoff? What are you doing with that runoff? I guess is the question at the end of the day. Are we reclaiming it? Are we cleaning it? Are we sending it back into our irrigation system and our main tanks? So do we have a separate water treatment system for that? Well, then we need process pH. We need to get to pH targets. Or maybe you're going to waste and you have to meet some type of environmental municipal requirement. Then you can do a handheld test and potentially release it or dump it. So it really comes down to what you're doing with that runoff at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like redundancy, you know, for checking data. You know, we always say, you know, one sensor, and Mike might disagree on this, but for me, from a grower, I always say one sensor is as good as 0 sensors. You need to have, you know, checks and balances within, you know, and not moving things around. So I typically find growers that are running with a stationary and they're double checking with their handheld meter. You know, making sure that it's calibrated. I mean, calibration super important, taking care of that equipment. So redundancy on double checking those factors, super important. And you see it, I'd say you see it more often in particular cannabis operations due to the high profitability of the crop, but also in large scale greenhouses and tomato, that redundancy. And, you know, Mike brings up really good points, but again, I encourage to have multiple sensors so you can understand the differences of what's happening in particular different areas of your grow room or environment, what's affecting that pH or EC runoff. It's, yeah, super important. Instead of just kind of moving things around, taking one sensor, moving it, and moving it, you know, you don't have a middle ground to kind of choose from of always knowing this is kind of your set standard. So there's going to be variances. We're dealing with a living crop, essentially.
That's a great point. Again, Ryan did it again. He brought me to a great point again. So if, for example, if you're injecting nutrients and you have a fertigation system, right? A hand fertigation system, you have a fertigation system, and you're basically sending water from that centralized irrigation room or facility in some cases, and you're pumping it out to your grow rooms, right? So there's a lot of things, no matter how incredible that machine can be and the technology we have, you're still pushing that water at high pressure, relatively high pressure, through an infrastructure, right? So a lot of things can happen under pressure. It depends what types of acid you're using. Phosphoric acid versus sulfuric acid versus citric acid all behave differently, all have different specific gravities, all behave differently under pressure in water. So what does that mean? Have a monitor in each room. Great point, Ryan. Ryan's right on the money. So even though you have that high-end fertigation system giving you that wonderful reading, you could be off a little bit depending on how the infrastructure is set up. So if you have a monitor in each room, basically as the water's coming in before it's distributed to your drip system, for example, then you could have a process monitor with a pH EC temperature reading on the wall that can feed back or allow your grower to make adjustments to the fertigation system because he may be off 0.1 or 0.2. Okay, so absolutely. And then each one of those growers should have a handheld right on their hip too, as well.
That's part of my toolkit. Have my Hanna pH pen. I make sure that it's all calibrated because you know, I go in and yes, we're a lighting company. People that change from HPS to LED, or if they make any changes, I'm sure if they add a fertigation, it's always the new thing's fault. But part of that toolkit that I go in, that infrared temperature gun, I bring mobile thermometers, hygrometers that will give me relative humidity and temperature, and I'll set up a couple of those, and I bring my own pH pin because you never know how much they've calibrated it, how old, if they've taken care of it. And the first thing that I want to do is essentially double check their reference of what they're using, just to, maybe that's not, but then we can at least take that factor and get it out of the equation if we're diagnosing some sort of issue or problem.
All right, excellent. We have a question next that it kind of does tag into this. So do you notice significant diminishing returns as the light intensity increases? So like you were saying, Ryan, with people switching, you know, from legacy lighting to LED, and then, oh, my plants are so hungry. Like we used to see that all the time. So the second part of that question is, at what point do you think is the level that is most efficient? I mean, we know that that's going to depend on your room, your cultivars, your, you know, a lot of things, but how would you, you know, recommend that someone go about finding that sweet spot? Because more is more with light, but it's not always more, as we know.
Right. No, and you talk. I mean, it's great you mentioned cultivar because that does have a lot to do with how far that you can drive those highlight demands. And we hear so much about crop steering techniques, and the simple answer is yes, there is a diminish of return is what you are putting in and what you're getting out. Cannabis is very unique. It is a very, very light hungry plant. We always say a 1% increase in DLI is typically a 1% increase in yield, which is quite significant. But if you look at any general cultivation, you find that even producing a cucumber or a tomato, the amount of light, the amount of CO2 that you're putting in doesn't equivalent from the amount of yield that you're putting in. We'll see plants essentially double or triple in yield from anywhere from raising from 700 micromoles up to 1,000. This is spectrum dependent. Not all we always like to say not all spectrums are created equally. So all PAR is not all created equal. So you really need to always keeping that in mind. But if we're sticking with general PAR, you know, you'll typically find a double to triple increase in yield production just between 700 to 1,000. That's 300 micromoles of light. But if I was to add that 300 on top of, you know, 1,000 and add it to 1,300, I am not going to see twice as much return as what I did when I increased from 300 to 700. That's where commercial ag starts to come into play, because it's much more profitable to find where that balance is. Yes, can a certain variety or strain handle 1,300 micromoles of light? Yes, I've seen it. I think we've finally hit this area of 1,600 micromoles is where they're finding that the line has started to stop so much that now they can feel that they've hit the saturation point. I can also tell you that most products grown under 1,600 micromoles of light typically have lower THC, lower cannabinoids. Frankly, people say it tastes like cardboard. So you know, you kind of have to keep all of those into control factors and what's your business plan. I tend to find in working with growers that, you know, we typically will recommend, you know, anywhere between well, what we first do, if they're coming from HPS, we want to understand what levels of light they're already working with, and we kind of work from there. We obviously don't want to give people less light, but we are providing them a more usable light from HPS to LED. You know, I still like growing around 950, 1,000, 1,050, but making sure that all my VPD has to be correct. My fertigation has to be very precise. The margin of error when you're running at high levels of light can become quite significant. So I'll run about 1,000 micromoles on average at my canopy and about 1,200 ppm of CO2, because that is, you have to have a CO2 when you're pushing. So yes, some techniques you can, you know, increase with some crop steering techniques. You can increase 100 micromoles every 2 days. I've been talking with some growers that are trying to ease their plants into a transition. That's a pretty easy spot to be able to obtain and maintain your plant health. But yeah, so some people are recommending these high levels of light, but the diminish of quality starts to go down. Quality and quantity doesn't start to work always hand in hand. It's always a fine balance.
Love it. Love it. All right. Next question is about dissolved oxygen. So this one's way over my head. So here we go. So how is dissolved oxygen important and becoming more prevalent in growing?
Well, dissolved oxygen is kind of like putting the root zone on steroids, if you will, and not in a bad way. Or maybe a better analogy would be like a runner taking oxygen, right? It's just everything is going to be stimulated, perform better. The root zone's going to be firmer. You're going to have much more increased uptake. So the performance of the plant is increased dramatically. So you're looking, you know, there is molecular infusion systems, that microbubblers that can get the DO up to 30 parts per million. Now, your normal atmospheric DO is like 8.4, 8.5 milligrams per liter or parts per million at 100% saturation. So we're talking 30 parts per million versus, let's say, 8 or 9 and standard 1 atmosphere, right? So that's pretty significant. You have to go down several meters in the water, right, to get that much hydrostatic pressure to contain that much dissolved oxygen. So that's pretty incredible. And it does a lot. Like I said, it really enhances the plant's ability to absorb nutrients, to do everything. It really stimulates the plant in every aspect, from growth to nutrient uptake. It also facilitates a couple of other things too. The more the oxygen is prevalent in your water, oxygen is in essence an oxidizer, just like chlorine, just like ozone, just like everything else, but it's Obviously, we breathe it, so we don't think of it in the same terms as chlorine or ozone, but it has to some degree the same effect. So contaminants don't like it much. So it does break down a lot of inorganics and organics that may be present in the water. Like if you're dealing with field ag, or it will affect iron. It will break down iron. It will break down a variety of other elements that could cause problems, that could plug up emitters, that could cause problems with your drippers. You won't see a lot of that, so to speak, in grow facilities, but there's a lot of advantage, not only from the perspective of the plant and its growth and performance, but also keeping that water clean, and keeping that water vital.
Very well said.
Perfect. Okay, and it wouldn't be an Ask the Experts webinar without a powdery mildew question. So, what do you think of the use of sulfur to treat powdery mildew, and how would you treat a PM problem? And I guess the instruments come into this, because I'm sure there's some, red flags that, give you some indicators that your environment might be, conducive to this.
Right on. I'd say it's environment. Stay away from sulfur. Most of the time, it's not legal to use in operations, especially in indoor. There can be, that residual sulfur can affect your quality of product. So I tend to stay away from sulfur. You're seeing a lot of different type of sulfur practices out there in the industry for increasing THC and cannabinoids, but again, I typically I would stay away from sulfur treatments when it comes to powdery mildew. Marie, I think that you've probably seen it too. Typically it's an environmental problem. You're having cold air coming in. My first instant effect, whoever sent that in, I would say get away from HPS as soon as possible, because they're probably utilizing some legacy lighting, and that is where I find the PM loves it. You're again heating up the surface temperature of the leaf. You're then dumping in cold air to combat that increase of leaf surface temperature from the infrared. That cold air creates a microclimate around that particular leaf or area of the plant, and boom, powdery mildew is there. So once you go down the LED route and you are running a room at 82 degrees, powdery mildew is not going to form over 78. So that is not a problem that luckily I've had to deal with for about 6.5 or about 7 years now with cultivating under LEDs. So definitely check your temperature. Make sure you minimize those microclimates as much as possible. Minimize spores from spreading. That's key. Once it's in the powdery mildew, that's the thing. People are like, well, once it's in the environment, it's going to be always in my environment. Powdery mildew is always in the environment. Let's just say that. It's not really any sort of stopping powdery mildew from being present in the environment. It's about creating conditions that powdery mildew can't and will not survive onto those crops and plants. So control your temperature and humidity. Make sure you can control those microclimates. Of course, you can do some organic type fungicides and some biofungicides that we see out there onto the market. I think that they're starting to become more and more prevalent. Things like Serenade and other bacterial applications that you can do. But most of that I would combat not utilizing it in flowering or any sort of particular edible crop. So my advice, really control that environment and making sure when I go say use LEDs, you want to use the tools to work with you, not against you. So yeah, that is my advice. And you can do some mineral oils and things like that, but your environment is going to control it the best way. And no, powdery mildew is not systemic in the plant. It's something that I've had to get a grasp with, but it's not systemic. Just because that plant health might be suffering and it's maybe more susceptible to powdery mildew, but it's not just embedded into there.
Agreed. That's absolutely true. Lighting, lighting, lighting. Okay, it's comes down to it. Let's not, sulfur is a old school primitive way. It's not good. I mean, sulfuric acid contains sulfur, right? So if that's any indication of the road you're on. So I would definitely say, from my personal experience, I have never dealt with it because of the facilities we deal with. They usually have that wrapped up. They have a more advanced lighting system, so they're really not dealing with that type of situation. When we do run into it, I advise, you can run through your cleaning cycle. You can run something all in mist slightly, but look, you shouldn't even have to worry about that if you're doing things the right way initially. It's not inherent to the plant. And Ryan's absolutely utterly correct in that. So I would say, yeah, lighting, lighting, lighting. Call Helio, definitely.
That's what we want to hear. What a beautiful closing statement from Mike. We have only a couple of minutes left, and I've just been sent the winners for our prize giveaway. So we have Matt Baker, and we're using a drum roll, Ryan. I like that. We should have done a drum roll. Matt Baker and Marianne McGuire. So you will get a reach out from Hanna Instruments very shortly for your details. And we will be sending out one of those fabulous Halo 2 Grow Line wireless soil pH testers. So that's fantastic. So we are right on time. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much, Ryan, for, we didn't get through all the questions. We never, ever do, ever. So if your questions were not answered today, you will get a follow-up email with some contact information, and get in touch with Hanna Instruments or Heliospectra. And yeah, we always like hearing from you and about your grows and your crops. And thank you both, Ryan and Mike, for today.
Thank you. It's always fun.
And yeah, thanks Marie for being a wonderful host, and really appreciate it. And thanks again to Hanna and Mike. It's always a pleasure working with you guys.
Same here.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Signing off. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Adios. Cheers.